Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Julie Mashak, Director of Global Programs in the 92Y's Belfer Center for Innovation and Social Impact. Thank you all so much for joining us. 92Y is very proud to present tonight's conversation with ProPublica, and a special thank you to Cynthia Giwa and the whole ProPublica team for making tonight's event possible. This event is part of a new series from 92Y called Campaign for 100%, which is exploring what changes when more people vote and participate in democracy. Please go to 92y.org/campaign for 100% to learn more. Check your registration, register to vote, and RSVP to future events in this series. A quick note, we are taking questions this evening. We have people joining us from a variety of platforms, but regardless of where you're watching, you can just put the questions in the comment section and they will get to us and to our panel. And now it is a great pleasure to introduce our guests this evening. Please join me in welcoming this amazing panel. Kristen Clarke is President and Executive Director of the National Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. Trey Grayson is a member of Frost Brown Todd and Managing Director of the firm's government relations affiliate Civic Point. He served as a two-term Secretary of State for the Commonwealth of Kentucky and as the chair of the Republican Secretaries of State Association. Tammy Patrick is a senior advisor to the elections program at Democracy Fund. And our moderator this evening is Jessica Huseman. She reports on voting rights and election administration for ProPublica. She is the lead reporter for ProPublica's Election Land Project, which helps hundreds of newsrooms across the US cover ballot access issues in real time. Jessica, over to you.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here with all of you. So I think that we should kind of just go ahead and start with a question that's likely on everybody's mind. And so, I know that we've been in this pandemic for 6 months, and the things that we were concerned about initially maybe aren't the largest concerns now, and the concerns have morphed. So I would love to hear from each of you, and I'd love to start with you, Kristen. If you could tell me what you were most concerned about in terms of access to the ballot box in the middle of a pandemic at the start of what we're dealing with now, and how that's changed, and what you're concerned about now. And then I'd love to hear from Trey and then from Tammy.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you for creating this space for this important conversation. At the outset of the pandemic, we saw the impact, very, very early on, and realized that there are a lot of states across the country that make it hard for people to exercise a full range of options that can ensure they have voice. Lots of states that, for example, require you to notarize an absentee ballot if it's going to count. States that require that you witness the ballot for it to count. States that restrict who has access to absentee ballots and who doesn't. And so we've been busy in the courts all across the country working to tear down a lot of the unfair, discriminatory, and unconstitutional barriers to the franchise, with the goal of ensuring that everybody can vote during this unprecedented moment that we're in. But I think that my level of anxiety, if you will, has changed in the last few days in the wake of the untimely passing of the giant of the Supreme Court, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, creating a vacancy that President Trump appears to be very interested in weaponizing to ensure that it is poised to resolve whatever election disputes that may arise out of the conclusion of this ongoing general election cycle. So that I think is very troubling. It suggests that notwithstanding the inappropriateness of filling a Supreme Court vacancy that arises as voters are literally casting ballots, but it suggests that his selection and choice of nominee will be fueled and driven not just by his commitment to overturning Roe v. Wade, which he's been very explicit about, but will also be driven by a desire to find someone who will grant him the outcome that he seeks in whatever election disputes that arise in the weeks ahead.
Okay, Trey, what about you?
So I guess I'd like to say that the thing that I'm most worried about is the ability of states and local jurisdictions to execute a lot of the really good plans that they've developed. Hopefully we can have some time to talk about some of the good things that have happened over the course of the year, which is a lot of innovation, a lot of creativity, new partnerships, making it easier to vote in ways that ought to be made permanent in some states. So there's a lot of good things going on, but the changes have been implemented rapidly. And so with getting the poll workers to do the right things, actually doing it on election day, and these the precincts opening, and also voters doing their part. A lot of voters are going to be voting using a method that is unusual for them. We're going to see a record number of vote by mail ballots being cast. A lot of those by people who don't normally vote that way. Same thing with early voting. And so the actual execution of this election is the thing that concerns me the most, followed probably closely by the understanding of the public. And I know I'm cheating, Jessica, and I'm giving 2 here. The understanding of the public is the results are being shared by members of the media starting when the polls close on election night, that's going to continue for a couple of days and maybe for weeks. And we have to have different expectations because of it'll just take longer to process these ballots, especially because we're doing it so quickly. The adjustment is being made so quickly. And so states that couldn't make permanent investments in training and in infrastructure because they weren't sure if they would need them again. And even if they did, they didn't have a lot of time to train. So those are my 2 concerns.
Okay, Tammy?
And I would add to both of those sentiments that 2020 is the gift that just keeps on giving in so many ways. When we think about what we've seen so far this year, from the primaries to the general, there definitely are some lessons that have been learned, and there are some things that I think will be better in some states than they were in the primaries because they were able to not just scale up existing procedures and policies in some places, but actually adopt some best practices for November. But I think that, it's absolutely the case that there are still challenges out there. And this moment has definitely exposed some fissures in the foundation of our system. And it's a moment where, I'm hopeful that we all rise to the occasion and everyone is able to do exactly what the title of this session is about, and that is ensure that everyone has the ability to participate given this historic moment that we're finding ourselves in. But every day it seems like there's a new twist, a new turn, a new angle. And that's what I think is really problematic is we saw in 2016 that the chaos and confusion that many seek to sow is back. And not that it really ever went away, but it's back with a force and a vengeance that we all just have to really be defensive against, and also on the offensive to make sure that that justice prevails.
Okay, thank you. And I since I've been covering voting, which has been about 4.5 years now, I hear activists all the time say, you need to make a plan to vote. You need to make sure that you know what you're doing and when you're doing and how you're doing it. How has that advice changed this year? Because I feel like the plans that folks made in 2018 or 2016 are not the plans that they're making in 2020. Kristen, can you speak to that?
Well, a lot of the planning activity revolves around navigating vote by mail hurdles, being on top of the deadlines, being on top of the requirements and rules that will ensure that your absentee ballot actually counts in your state. So we lead a program called Election Protection, which is the nation's largest and longest running nonpartisan voter protection program. We're hearing from lots of voters on our 866 Our Vote hotline, and a lot of those calls are coming from people who are just not sure about how to go about voting absentee for the first time. But I also think that it's interesting. There's this tension. There are a lot of people who want to figure it out, but on the one hand, you're hearing concerns about the U.S. Postal Service and the delays there. And so there's some people who are saying it doesn't sound like it's worth the gamble. And so we've had to do some work to restore public confidence in vote by mail. And one of the ways that we've done that is we've sued the U.S. Postal Service to hold them accountable for some of the devastating policy changes they've made under the new Postmaster General. But we're also dealing with the misinformation campaign. a president that unfortunately promotes a lot of confusion, that undermines the public's confidence in vote by mail by suggesting that it is fraudulent, and that there are, tons of people who are casting fraudulent ballots by mail, foreign countries that are seeking to do the same. And so clearing up some of that disinformation so that we can restore public confidence in this important method of election has been a part of the work that we've been doing this season.
Okay. And Tammy, what resources would you give to voters this year that maybe weren't as necessary in years past? Should they be looking in different places, or is the advice the same?
I think the advice has shifted just a little bit this year because of the situation that we find ourselves in, and because voters have different options this year than they maybe have had in the past. And they may need to factor in different things when they make their decision on what is the correct plan to vote in a global pandemic and their own health and safety of their families and their communities. The one main element I would say is action early. Early action is really, really critical in this moment, more so than any other. We know that a lot of the voter registration activity, yesterday was just voter registration day. However, a lot of the normal activity is not happening because we're not going to the farmers market on the weekends. We're not having county fairs. Candidates and election officials are not out, interacting with voters, and as well as all the third party groups going door to door. So in this moment, if you act early, if there is an issue with your voter registration, you can discover it in plenty of time, hopefully before a registration deadline, and that's going to be critical. It's also important, we often talk about, having plan A and plan B, but if your plan to vote this year is November 3rd, you have no option of plan B. If your plan A is to go in person on election day, that leaves you no other backup. And that's really what I think is in this moment. We need to take early action. Remember that the voters are the ones that hold the power in this moment, and to be sure that they're exercising it early, because the other layer of all of this is that we don't know if there'll be another hotspot, if there'll be another surge. Lord knows we've seen some pretty crazy weather events happening, and all of those things can occur still in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, great. And I would love for Trey to answer this next question from one of the folks that's commented in our chat. So he says, this is from Adam, and he says, how can local governments play a role in showing voters how safe and absent of fraud this process is? And I think that you're a specifically interesting person to talk about this, because you were once the head election official in a state that has probably, I think, across the country, taken the most bipartisan route to solve our current election crisis. So it'd be great if you could kind of go over the steps that Kentucky has taken, and then answer sort of how local governments can help increase that confidence.
Sure. Yeah, Kentucky, there was a law that was passed several years ago in the legislature, actually when I was secretary, to allow elections to be postponed in the case of a state of an emergency. It was actually passed when I was secretary. In 2004, we were thinking about terrorism or weather acts or something like that. 9/11, for example, took place on a primary day in New York City, and Hurricane Sandy impacted the 2012 election. So we've seen this, and it's happened in other countries. And this year they tweaked it to allow the governor and the secretary of state to come up with a new plan of voting, a new manner of voting, not just change the date. So Kentucky normally has a May primary. We're in the middle of a pandemic. We have a Democratic governor, a Republican secretary of state, who've had some policy disagreements in the legislature, specifically on a photo ID bill. But they came together for the primary and came up with a plan, and got it approved and executed it pretty well. We had if you kind of look at how a Republican secretary and a Democratic governor coming together with the Republican legislature and a mixture of Republicans and Democrats at the county clerk level, that's the person who is elected to help run, among other duties, our elections. They did a great job. They took those lessons and learned and have tweaked them for the fall. We're going to rely less on vote by mail. In the primary, we had about 75% of votes cast vote by mail. In a traditional Kentucky election, it's 5%. So this is a tremendous change. But we also know we're going to have maybe twice the turnout in a general election. So this plan is to focus more on having, with an intense poll worker recruitment effort, to have more in-person voting early and on election day, and have more vote centers. So if you have fewer locations, you can at least go to any one of them that's in your community. And again, it was a bipartisan plan. put together in this tough political environment. So kudos to Andy Beshear, our Democratic governor, and our Republican Mike Adams. Now, at the local level, one of the things I think we saw a lot in the primaries were jurisdictions using cameras to show the vote counting process to the public, making it transparent. There are already laws in the books that usually allow campaigns and political parties to be in the room, and they're almost always there. But that's a small group, and it's not something that most people worried about. But now people have a greater interest, and there's a lot of new changes, and so there's some lack of familiarity. So having those video cameras to watch that. We see more media outlets covering election administration issues, so they can play an important role in helping the local officials explain the processes. Tammy was an local election administrator before she and I were. President Obama plucked us out of obscurity at the state and local level to help us become more involved at the national level. But the media can play a really important role in that transparency. But the local administrators have to embrace that.
Yeah.
Do. And if they do, it's just a great success story where the media gets a story, the administrators get the assistance, and the voters are the winners.
That's great. And Tammy, I know you used to be a local election official, so I'd love for you to speak to this as well. How can local governments play a role in showing how safe this process is?
I think that it's really critical that in the rare instances that there are, that fraud does occur, that we talk about it, and that we demonstrate that it is in fact prosecuted and what happens, and that it is so exceedingly rare. And that's one of the most important things that we can do. And then also walking through with, as Trey mentioned, with the press and with others, exactly what safeguards are in place to prevent someone from voting illegally, but not to be so stringent and so strict that eligible voters aren't able to vote. And here's a perfect example. I think we hear a lot about ballot curing. And in this moment, we know there's going to be, large numbers of ballots that will be called into question. And some of them will be rejected based on being late or on the signature itself. So ballot curing is oftentimes discussed as a good customer service, benefit, because you're seeking out the voter and trying to cure their ballot if there's an issue with it or a problem. But it's just as equally a security measure, because if there's not a signature there or the signature doesn't match, if you don't reach out to that voter and talk to them and find out why didn't the signature match or why wasn't there a signature, you don't know the whole story. And I will tell you, I called hundreds, if not thousands, of those voters, and never once did I have a voter say, I didn't vote my ballot. They had hands in casts. They had recently suffered a stroke. They were signing. My favorite one was the voter said, I can't believe you called. I was signing it while I was driving down the 202. It was in Phoenix with my envelope on the dashboard of my car. And so if you don't reach out, you don't really know. Why was that signature wrong? And so that's the sort of thing that when you have that kind of transparency, I think it gives people confidence. Additionally, having ballot tracking. So more and more states are offering ballot tracking now. We had 2 or 3 announced today. I think there's another one coming tomorrow. Getting a text message that tells you exactly where your ballot is along the process gives you that level of security that you know what's happening along the lines of, along the entire line of the process. And that goes a long way, because you don't want to believe that the ballot's just going out into the ether with the, at the post office. And having that tracking capacity is really, really a benefit to the voters as well.
Great. So I want to give folks just a little bit of hope before maybe we make them throw that in the trash. I don't know. But I would love to know from each of you which states you'll give you kind of the most hope that everything's going to be fine in November, even if that's not true across the country. Kristen, is there a state that you're particularly a fan of in this time?
It's such a great question. I think Michigan has kind of stepped up this season under their Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson. I feel like they've been very proactive in seeing around the corners and really trying to truly just make it easy for people across the state. We know that in Michigan, for example, Black people and people of color have been disproportionately hit by the pandemic. And I just think that to be in a category of a state that hasn't done massive vote by mail before, that she's shown true leadership. So yeah, that's one that's given me some hope.
What about you, Trey?
So of course Kentucky, but I can't answer Kentucky. I mean, I just did, but I'm going to say Iowa, just because I've been really impressed going back to the primary with Secretary Pate's leadership and trying to, make sure that Iowa adapted to a pandemic. They sent absentee request forms to all the voters in the primary. I think they're doing the same thing in the general. And he just seems somebody he's a Republican secretary who rises above politics. He's the past and past president, and I just have really been impressed with his leadership. And just to be clear, the Iowa primary app problem, that was not election administrators. That was a political party that had an app problem. But Iowa's used to being in the national spotlight. They're a battleground state. They have always competitive Senate and congressional races. And I think Paul's done a really good job leading that state. So I expect to not have to worry too much about Iowa when it comes to election administration.
Oh, sorry, I muted. What about you, Tammy?
So it's kind of like asking a parent to pick their favorite child. So I would instead say that the states that have done many of the things that the others have mentioned, been proactive in mailing out applications or mailing out ballots to voters, those who have seen expansion of options for voters to be able to make informed choices, whether it's more days, more ways, or more hours. Those who are prepaying the ballot coming back to the election official, expansion of use of drop boxes, allowing for a postmark to be a valid indicator that the voter mailed it back in time. These, I think, are all characteristics of sound leadership in this moment. And we do know that, unfortunately, because I think you're probably going to pivot here to where things dire and apocalyptic, is that there are places where many election officials from both sides of the aisle at the state and local level have been arguing and articulating for these very options, and are being prevented from really serving the voters best in this moment. I mean, we are in a global pandemic, and the fact that some of these things are being weaponized and politicized is astounding to me, and sad.
And sad. Trey, what worries you?
And I hate to pick on a state because that's like the opposite of what Tammy just said of choosing among all the children that you love. I guess I'm just worried about Pennsylvania. It's a battleground state. It's a big state. A lot of electoral votes. So it really matters a great deal. Where the legislature is still meeting. I have hopes that they're going to tweak some of their rules to do things like allow the absentee ballots to be processed earlier than on election day, and maybe some other changes. There's still some court litigation going on in Pennsylvania. And so when you have a big battleground state that had trouble in the primary, it took a long time to count the absentee ballots. So they're doing a lot of changes. Battleground state, Philadelphia elections have always been a challenge over the years. And then some of the uncertainty on the rules and where people are already voting in many of the states. That's one that I would flag. But maybe I'd give a different answer in a week or two if the General Assembly or legislature there is able to tweak some of the laws and get that done and provide that certainty that the election administrators and the voters need.
Okay, great. Kristen?
Georgia.
Okay.
Talk to me about that. On my mind. Yeah, I think, Georgia during the primary was a very messy picture. And it just kind of continues this trend that we have seen with Georgia since the Shelby County v. Holder ruling. Georgia just has been a hotbed of voter suppression, voting discrimination, and just not quite getting it right when it comes to ensuring full access across the board. We actually just found out about a local purge effort quietly filed in one of the local courts, an effort to strip eligible people off the rolls in the 11th hour. The long lines that we saw during this primary season were simply inhumane. They outsourced their handling of absentee ballots to a vendor located on the other side of the country that made massive errors, including sending ballots to the wrong address, sending the wrong ballot altogether. Georgia is just a very, very messy state. And I think the primary suggests a need for dramatic reform and a total overhaul to their approach. And I don't know that that's happening. I mean, even issues like translating materials for limited English proficient voters that are required to have language access under the Voting Rights Act. Just in every category, I feel like Georgia's getting too much wrong this season.
Okay, that makes sense to me. And then, COVID has kind of made it difficult to think of anything outside of, I don't know, being stuck in your house. But, in addition to the transition to vote by mail, none of the problems that affected us in 2018 or 2016 have gone away, right? We've got cybersecurity concerns. We have administration concerns. We've got funding concerns. What do you think that we should still be focused on right now, if anything? Oh, I guess I should direct that question to somebody, huh? Tammy, why don't you kick it off?
So I think that's spot on. And not only is it the case that state and local election officials have been, conducting the elections given basically the same resources, but with a whole new onslaught of costs. So whether it's PPE or now needing to pay for polling places because so many locations are denying access to be used as a polling location. And then also the massive turnover of poll workers. We're going to have an election where all across the country, we will have literally hundreds of thousands, if not potentially millions of first-time poll workers and first-time voters in just numbers that we've never seen before. And all of that is going to be, a challenge. When we talk about the cybersecurity element of this, because you're right, that hasn't gone away, but fold in the fact that many people are working from home. And so making sure that all of the cyber hygiene that was taking place in the local and state elections offices are also being done on home computers, and the connectivity that people are doing is really, really critical, because our foreign adversaries have not gone away. They've continued to be more and more sophisticated. And although we have some amazing infrastructure now that we did not have a few years ago to help support election officials in shoring up their systems, it's still an ever evolving situation. And it's not going to go away just because of a global pandemic.
Sure. Kristen, is there anything outside of mail voting that concerns you?
Well, I am worried about Bush v. Gore type scenarios after this election, for sure. And the president is at a press conference right now and has kind of reiterated this theme that, we'll have to kind of see what happens in terms of his willingness to accept the outcome of the election. And that's troubling. I think it just suggests that we're in a very fragile state as a democracy. But I'm bracing for the possibility of just a lot of litigation at the state level. You set aside the presidential election, and we know that contests down the ballot can come down to razor thin margins, and it's going to be important to count all of those absentee ballots to truly decide the outcomes of races as you move down the ballot. And the potential for challenges and mischief and litigation is something that concerns me and something that we are preparing for.
Okay. Trey, what about you?
So I'll mention a couple. One that we haven't mentioned yet that we'll just have to see how this plays out. We talked earlier about the challenges. I think Tammy mentioned the challenges of getting people registered in a pandemic because you don't have the outreach of the campaigns aren't going door to door as often. You didn't have the summer fairs and even just tabling in front of a grocery store, things like that. But we also had government offices closed. So a lot of people register, or maybe more importantly for this point, because we haven't talked about this, update because they're moving around. 10% of Americans are moving around. So one thing that hasn't gotten a lot of attention yet, but worries me, is that people are living in one spot, they're registered in another spot, and they're going to find out after mid-October, when the deadlines pass in most states, that they're not eligible to vote, or they have to take some extra steps to vote. And that's something that concerns me. Yet another thing for us to be worried about in the election administration world. The disinformation is something Tammy's absolutely right. We are in a much better shape today in being prepared to address it than we were 4 years ago. One of the most important, most telling data points to me that I like to share is at the 2016 Secretary of State's conference, the disinformation, foreign interference, cybersecurity was not even mentioned. And the amount of effort, this program is part of a series endowed by the Belfer family, the Belfer Center at Harvard. Lots of groups and companies have stepped up to the plate to help election administrators. There's security clearances that didn't exist. There's information sharing, sector coordinating councils. There's a whole lot going on, but it's also 4 years more for our adversaries to invest and get better as well. So that's just something we have to continuously monitor, and it would be probably the big story. And then the last thing is, it's just a presidential election. There are a lot of voters, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong. And so it was always, even in a boring year like 2004, 2008, which by comparison seemed like boring elections compared to this one, and in the administration land, those are really hard to pull off. And there are challenges for voters and challenges for administrators. So just on a normal every 4 years, this is a hard thing. And we're trying to pull it off in a pandemic, and a time when foreign adversaries are aiming at us. And I'm really glad that there's some great people who are trying to solve this problem. But it's tough. It's a really tough world out there right now.
Okay. And so, we have another good reader question, or listener, I should say. I'm not used to being on spoken word news. So we have Chris, who asks, any view whether the Supreme Court this year would likely treat Bush v. Gore as precedent after all and not as a one-off as the court previously declared? I'd love to get the answer to that question from you, Kristen. And I know that you had mentioned you're concerned about litigation. So if you want to speak about that more broadly as well, that would be great.
So I think the court made fairly clear that Bush v. Gore is indeed a one-off that applies to those specific factual circumstances. So, that's kind of my quick answer. However, I don't think there's anything that stops this court from viewing, disputes or issues that arise out of any state in 2020, 2 decades later, as terrain that they would not step into again. And that's what concerns me. I think that there are a lot of Americans that feel like it was inappropriate for the judicial branch to step in and be the kind of final arbiter of what was unfolding in Florida. And I see the potential for this court being willing to once again meddle, step in, interject in state level election disputes that may potentially arise again this season. And that's very problematic.
Okay. Trey, Tammy, anything to add?
I'll just say, I think Kristen's right. The court did make clear that it was not precedential. However, the basis of the ruling was an equal protection argument or equal protection analysis. That's always something that the court has an interest in. And so, yeah, if they want to get involved, they'll get involved. Whether there's a Bush v. Gore precedent or whether it's not a precedent, we could very well see them get involved. I mean, our hope in the election administration, where we always pray for large margins, so that some of the challenges just sort of get worked out because they aren't as important. And so, if this is a very close election, there'll be a lot of litigation in states, and it will likely work its way up the appellate levels.
Okay. Tammy, anything to add?
I'm going to leave it to the attorneys, even though I like to Monday quarterback on these things. I'll pass.
Sounds good. I think the three of you know this very well, but it might surprise some of our listeners to know that the federal government plays only a very small role in election administration. And so Spencer has asked, what aspects of election administration, if any, should the federal government take charge of? And I'd love for you to tackle that, Tammy.
So I saw that question, and I've been ruminating over like my wish list of what it would be. And I think, quite frankly, there's definitely that tension between the states don't want the federal government to intervene. Mm-hmm. I will tell you, local election officials don't want the state to intervene.
Correct.
And municipal clerks surely do not want the counties telling them what to do. So everybody wants everyone else to stay out of their cat box, as it were, or sandbox was probably a cleaner analogy. But when all is said and done at the end of the day, there are systemic issues and challenges with the way some states have in their dates and deadlines is the perfect example. So we know that the Postal Service says to mail back your ballot 1 week before it's due. In that time period, that week before Election Day, there are 22 states that allow a voter to still request a ballot, which sets them up to fail because it sets a false expectation that in 7 states, you can request a ballot on Monday for Tuesday's election and everything will be fine. Voters assume that if it's a deadline, it still means they'll be okay. And in those states, they won't be. So I do think that there are some places where this is not a new issue. Lord knows, I've been shouting about it from the mountaintops for 5 years now. And some states have adjusted, but others have not. And it's coming to bear now in what those challenges will be. So I think that there are some places where the federal government can lay down rules and guidelines, particularly as it relates to voting by mail and early voting and allowing and making sure that some of these options are available to every American in a federal election.
Got it. Trey, anything you wish the federal government would have taken off your hands while you were state election administrator?
Well, one, I just want to say, I think Tammy's identified a really good one. It's somewhat analogous to what Congress 10 plus years ago engaged on the MOVE Act, which was to address military and overseas voting. We had states not sending absentee ballots out in enough time to be received and sent back when you have to traverse the airplanes, trains, and automobiles to get to people all around the world. And so Congress, in a bipartisan manner, agreed with setting that, saying you have to do it at least X number of days, which is 45 in advance. And that forced some of those states that wouldn't do it to move some primaries and to change their deadlines. And so this is a great example of, my view is we ought to have the federal government involved when there's some consensus that there's a good thing that needs to be mandated at the federal level, and we have some states that aren't doing it. Okay. So another one that I would add isn't so much a procedure as much as a funding issue. I think with the rise of the concern with election security, and there is a national security component to it. I tend to be one who I like the decisions at the elections level, at the state and local level. But this is one where what I'd like to see is consistent funding to help states. And maybe there's a little bit of some, paper ballots, risk limiting audits, or, statistically significant audits or something like that as a part of it. But the federal government ought to provide some financial support because this is a national security function, and the federal government, everybody agrees, should be involved with national security. So I'd like to see a steady amount, probably smaller than these big chunks that we've got. I guess we got once in the CARES Act and once in when they released some more Help America Vote Act dollars a couple of years ago for security. So states and locals could plan on the money being there and then match it locally and budget and make capital expenses and training expenses and things like that. So that would be on my wish list as the next item.
Perfect. Kristen, what about you?
So I think the pandemic has ripped the Band-Aid off in terms of exposing just how fractured our electoral system is based on the fact that we give states so much discretion in how they structure their elections. And I get it. It's important that our local and state election officials have that latitude to design systems that will be responsive to their voters, and they know their voters best. However, it is crazy to me that in one state you can have voters amid a pandemic who can sit back and exhale and know that absentee ballot application with a stamped envelope or the actual absentee ballot itself is just going to arrive and they don't have to do anything more. And in a state next door, you've got a situation where you may not be eligible because you don't fall into a category, and you've got an official who is bent on not relenting during the pandemic to open up access. You may have a state next door where that voter has to go out and get 2 people to come into their home to witness their ballot, or go out and find a public notary in the middle of a pandemic to ensure their ballot counts. We need more uniformity. I think we need to move to a lot more uniformity and address this insanely fractured system that we have. And to me, one of the biggest things is that we shouldn't have a pandemic without guidance being issued from our federal government to help states kind of figure it out. Instead, states have had to really navigate this terrain all on their own. I listened to a great NPR story this morning about an election official who decided to go out and buy Q-tips and cover them with foil to help. And, that's great, but why isn't our federal government helping to facilitate some of that thinking this election season? So I'd love to see more good guidance, more uniformity, once we kind of get a chance to catch our breath after this pandemic.
If I could add one thing to that, Jessica, I think because I immediately went to what would I want, what new thing would I want. But when Trey and I were on the commission, one of the things that we did say very strongly is we feel that the federal government should also enforce the laws we already have. So making sure that the Voting Rights Act is robustly enforced, making sure that language assistance is being enforced, making sure that our polling places are ADA compliant for equal access to all of our voters, making sure that our military and overseas voters are receiving the services that they deserve under federal law. So I also believe that that is a role that the federal government needs to play, but not to overstep.
Okay, that's a good point. So we have two folks in the comment section, Kelsey and Adam, who are asking about the possibility of the election not being clear on election night. And so I want to ask a two-part question that's going to kind of combine what they want to know. So one, what do you think the risk is that we won't know the results of the election for quite some time? I hear sort of competing theories on this from election administrators. Some say, hey, ballots are already being cast. They're going to process them. It's going to be fine. We're going to know the results of the election. And some people say it could take weeks. So I'd love to get a temperature check on where you all are here. And then I would also like to ask, if you want to, we can address this as a second question, but I think maybe you'll want to wrap it all up together. How can local election officials, even amidst that uncertainty, reinforce confidence in the system? So why don't we start with you, Trey?
Gee, thanks for that. Let me go first on that one, Jessica. No, it's fine. So there's a couple of one, as I said earlier, if it's if large margins, we might know at 11 p.m. on election night, like we sometimes do, 11 p.m. Eastern time. That's probably not going to be the case. But because this is an electoral college election and it's a state-by-state election, it is possible. A good example is Florida, which we haven't talked too much about yet, which is odd in an election conversation. Kristen's example of the local election administrator who was innovative with the Q-tip, he's a Florida guy. So, Florida's innovating. But Florida didn't really change many of their laws. They've had early voting without an excuse and mail voting without an excuse and traditional election day. So perhaps Florida won't be as bumpy. And for example, if Vice President Biden is able to have enough of a margin on election night, we might get kind of traditional margin or reporting reports back on Florida. We might know something on election night. But on the other hand, current law in Michigan doesn't allow absentee ballots to be processed until 7 a.m. on election day. So Michigan may not have enough results in a close election until Thursday or Friday. So if I'm a viewer of this, I'm going to go into election night thinking I'm probably not going to know, but I may have some idea. Now, if I wanted to pivot to the second part of your question, I participated in the Transition Integrity Project's simulations, a couple which have gotten some national publicity, including some allegations that those of us who did them were part of a coup to overthrow the Trump administration. I'm still Republican. I'm not trying to overthrow the Trump administration. If they did, they didn't tell me that was the point of what we were doing. But we gamed out different scenarios, including, a close election with unclear margins and at comfortable margins. And it is, one of the things that is one of the challenges of the election for this year, and in addition to everything else, just this larger, neither side trusts the other side. And a lot of voters, too many voters, don't trust the process or the outcome. And there's some good reasons why they might not. But that's just the reality. And so the ability to accept an outcome and the campaigns and the political parties' willingness to maybe break some norms to try to, reinforce that. I do have concerns about all that, hopefully we'll get enough results and some clarity that people will have confidence that, okay, election day, election week, election month went pretty well. Let's count election counting month or week. Let's focus on that and go forward. But it could be a challenging, a couple of days or a couple of weeks, but I also think back to in 2000, when I went to bed, well, actually, when I went to bed, I thought I knew who the president was, but when I woke up, I didn't. In 2004, it looked like President Bush had been reelected, but Secretary Kerry didn't, or Senator Kerry then didn't concede until the next day. 2008, we knew. In 2012, we knew. 16, we didn't really know. We thought we knew late, but it was well after midnight. It wasn't really till the next day that Secretary Clinton conceded. So the last few elections, we have not known at 11 p.m. on Eastern time, even in a more normal election, and maybe a less divided or less heatedly divided country.
Okay, great. Tammy, you wanna take that away?
So I immediately thought of something that I heard Ned Foley say recently, and that is on election night, we have a declared projected winner from the media. And of course, it's never the case that we have a winner on election night. It's the projected declared winner. And I think that's really important for everyone to remember, is that it is nothing new to have millions of ballots being counted after election day. And that's where we have some real challenges with the language that's being already used before November's even hit, before it's even October, about delayed results. Everything's going to be delayed, when in fact, the process plays out this way. And that's why everyone doesn't canvass their election with official winners the next day. Some states, it's 5 days, 7 days. In California, it's, I believe, 23 or 28 days before they do their official canvass. And that's when the winner is declared. So I think it's really important that when we talk about the election night results, that we talk about them appropriately, because words really do matter in this instance. And I always like to also remind voters, I'm always early, don't wait. But for the voters that return their ballots in the vast majority of states, that ballot is counted and is part of election night results. So when the holograms hit in my former jurisdiction in Arizona, on election night, the results that hit when the polls had closed, those were predominantly vote by mail and early ballots cast, early in person. And then the precincts kind of trickled in. And that's really critical. So if voters request early, get their ballot, have plenty of time, return it well in advance of election day, we could have large portions of the electorate's ballots already being counted. The question is going to be, there are those 11 states where as of today, at this point in time, the election officials can't start counting them yet. And they are states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So, but that can all change. There's a lot of litigation happening. There's legislation that is still being discussed, although it looks pretty unlikely at this point.
Okay. Kristen?
Yeah, I think the ground has been well covered. This one is just going to require a lot of patience. I think it's just not realistic to expect that we'll have firm election results, especially all the way down the ballot on election night, and not when it is the case, as already noted, that some of those ballots can't even be counted until the election itself is,
Okay.
has
Jessica,
closed.
if I can add something,
Yeah.
2018, we were together on election day. Election Lane had a war room, so to speak, with reporters, stringers taking calls from reporters and asking questions. And remember, when we left that night, it didn't look like the Democrats had really had such as good a night. But again, as Tammy, because not all the votes had been counted. And that was kind of a normal election. We weren't in the pandemic. People were voting with traditional ways. And in the days following that, as the absentee ballots were counted, as provisional ballots were counted, the interpretation of what happened in 2018 was very different a couple days later. So this is normal. We should have that expectation. These are unofficial results. These are projections. But I was just thinking about that in 2018, because I remember when we left, we weren't thinking it was a blue wave.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a blue wave in the House anyway. Red wave in the Senate, I guess, a little bit, but blue wave in the House, but not at 11 p.m. on Eastern time on election day.
Definitely. And we're about 10 minutes to the end here, and I want to make sure that you guys have a couple of minutes to say, any closing remarks that you might like to add. But one question that I'd love to get you guys to answer is something that Kelsey in the comments asked, which is, where can people go for reliable voting information? And I know that this is something that you have been messaging a lot, Tammy, and I would love for you to tackle this question pretty quickly if you're willing.
Yeah, so I would suggest going to your state and local election officials as your first source. Also, know when you receive mail, look for the official mail logo on it, because that shows that it's actually coming from an election official. A lot of times the mailers try to look official when they're really not. So you want to go to your trusted source as your state and local official. And then if there are other places where you are confident with the information that you receive, you can continue to trust them for your election information. So it's not that only state and local election officials are the ones with some kind of corner on the market on what is true, but they definitely have the official information and what's up to date as things change in the courts and in the capitals.
Got it. Okay. Well, we've got about 8 minutes left, and I think we've taken care of all the questions that we're going to be able to get to today. But I would love to start with Kristen and then go to Trey and then go to Tammy for any closing remarks that you have, anything that we didn't get to today that you think it's important for the listeners on this call and their friends who are planning on casting a ballot to know.
Yeah, I think the voting season has started, right? So I do think it's important to make your plan and not wait until the last minute. And we have a growing network of legal volunteers. We're currently at about 12,000 volunteers who staff the Election Protection 866, Our Vote hotline, and we're helping voters all across the country. It doesn't matter what state you're in, doesn't matter your partisan affiliation. Our goal is to make sure that voters can overcome the obstacles they face this season. And I guess I would just close by making a point about having this conversation amid the gut-wrenching news about Breonna Taylor. And I know that there are many people who are marching and protesting right now in Louisville and across the country who feel a grave sense of injustice, and rightfully so. And it's important that we make sure that we safeguard the right to protest in our country. It's one of our most important rights as a democracy. And I think it dovetails with the discussion that we've been having about voting rights, another true core important right in our democracy. And we've got to do all we can to fight to preserve those rights and to fight for justice.
Trey?
Yeah, I just want to echo the Breonna Taylor thing. I'm in Kentucky still, and we were on pins and needles waiting for the announcement today. And hopefully the next couple, as a state and as a country, the next couple of days we can get through this. And voting is an important part of getting through this. Changing laws is an important part of getting through this. I want to highlight a couple of things that we haven't had a chance to talk about that I've been really happy to see in this election, and I hope that they continue going forward. And one is the growing number of creative partnerships that are taking place. Yesterday is a great example. So yesterday was National Voter Registration Day. And one of the big groups that has really stepped up to the plate to both amplify messages and just to reach out to different types of audiences is the sports community. And I want to give a lot of credit to Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson in Michigan. She's got a background where she has connections to the professional sports industry and created partnerships in Michigan. And through her efforts, you see professional athletes like LeBron James in his group. And I'm one of their, in disclosure, I'm an advisor to his election administration advisor to his group. But having LeBron James remind people of deadlines and encouraging them to register, to update, to participate, that's how we're going to reach this. The theme of this is 100% participation. The only way we're going to get closer to that number is through these non-traditional partnerships. We see businesses stepping up, even conservative, stodgy businesses that don't necessarily want to get around elections stepping up. Like in Cincinnati, there's an insurance company named Western and Southern Life. And you wouldn't expect somebody like them, but they're giving a paid day off to every employee who wants to be a poll worker that day. And so these partnerships have been great. We see the craft beer industry in Ohio and Kentucky. We're spreading messages about poll workers and voter registration deadlines. Let's keep that up as a country. That's how we're going to increase participation. That's how we're going to improve the process. And let's not just wait until we have a pandemic to get those efforts to step up. So that's been really exciting to me. Some of the innovations and some of these partnerships that just really they're transcending. These are not like faux partisanship, nonpartisan efforts. These are legit, like they just believe in our democracy and want to help the system work better. And I applaud those efforts and hope they continue.
And, we're a proud partner of More Than a Vote. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. It's great to see so many athletes and people with platforms leveraging those platforms this season.
I think the funniest private business that I've seen encouraging people to be poll workers was OkCupid, the dating app. It was like, you're hot if you vote, you're hotter if you're a poll worker. And I was like, this is
awesome.
amazing. Tammy, what would you like to leave our listeners with?
Yeah, so I think one other thing that strikes me is that, in this moment, it's almost been eclipsed, but this is the 100th anniversary of suffrage for women. And I think that in this moment, everyone has changed the way we act on a day-to-day basis. We change the way we stand in line at the grocery store. And in this moment, we may change the manner in which we vote. It doesn't mean that you have to vote by mail in perpetuity. But in this moment, it just may very well be that you're going to change the way that you normally engage in the franchise. And that's why it is so critical that we have plans in place and backup plans. And I've said it a number of times, but I'll say it one more time. And that is, don't wait to register or check your registration. Don't wait to request your ballot. Don't wait to return it. Just get it back in. You're not going to change who you decide you want to vote for president. We all know that. And then if you decide you do want to vote in person, make sure that you have a couple of options. So, vote early. We've already seen individuals lining up for the first days of early voting. And those tend to be kind of busy in some cases. But the days in the middle of the early voting period are usually not busy at all. And many jurisdictions have wait time apps so you can see if in fact there is a line. So if you do have health concerns, you can find the place that's going to be the most convenient for you to be able to safely vote in person. And then have November 3rd as your backup day. And then the last thing I would say is that it is absolutely only legal to vote once. And I didn't realize I would have to say that in this moment, but we continue to need to reinforce that it is in fact only legal to vote once in an election. And so don't vote twice.
Yeah, so vote early, but not often, right?
Vote early, but just the one time.
Yeah, exactly.
I will echo that is a funny thing. My first national TV spot this election season, I was like, this is it. People finally care about election administration. This is my moment. And what was I telling people? It is illegal to vote 2 times. Let down. But whatever. Anyway, thank you guys so much for doing this. And I will just let our listeners know that in addition to 888-VOTE, which I very much encourage you to call if you have problems.
866.
866. Did I say 888? I'm sorry. 866-RVOTE. And we work with 866-RVOTE at Election Land to get tips and so we know where local reporters should go to cover those issues. Trey has been in the room. Tammy has been in the room with us, helping us navigate this complicated time. And we're going to be doing it again this year. So if you have issues or you think there's something that your local media should know about, I encourage you to go to election.land and you can find contact information for us there. And we would be happy to connect you with local reporters who can shine a better light on some of the issues that you might face. So I will turn it back over to the folks at the Y, but thank you guys so much for being in the audience during this panel. These issues are so important to discuss, and I'm so glad that the Y gave us a platform to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.